much of what we do is like an iceberg. The iceberg only shows us 10% of its mass above the ocean level, and the other 90% is hidden. And the only way you know it's there is when you hit it and sink from it, like the Titanic. And at the same time, those hidden beliefs are not owned up to and not recognized, and that's what steers what people do and don't do. Every time one of my students gets an administrative job, first thing I say to them is, learn the culture. Our society should have seen COVID coming, not necessarily specifically COVID in February of 2019 or March when it really hit us between the eyes, but we should have been ready for a development like that, so that when it did hit, we would have been better prepared for its effects. I was talking to a superintendent just before this was happening. I was going to do a consult to myself and to my colleagues in a district in a rather poor part of New York State. And I said to the superintendent, who happened to be one of my mentees in his dissertation, I said, "Are you ready for what's coming?" This is February. And I said, "Are you ready?" And he says, "For what?" And I said, "Pandemic is coming. You're going to be closing your schools." And he said, "We're not closing the schools. We're out in the boondocks. We're out in a rural part of New York. That's something that's going to happen in the cities, maybe, but certainly not going to happen out here." I said, "Listen to me. It's happening everywhere."
Identify your general why. Why do you want that? Because you want to be more loving, you want to just be more giving and more uplifting. Welcome. I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Dr. Richard Bernato, author of Co-Creating the Future, published by Solution 3 in 2024. And now I'm so thrilled to have you here, Dr. Bernato, to discuss your beautifully written and important book in order to unlock the potential also for the future in our schools.
Well, very, very pleased, extremely pleased to have an opportunity to share my points of view with you and help the audience hopefully recognize some issues and themes and some unique ways to really look at how education can shape and be reshaped and renewed to transform what it is we want to do. So this is a terrific opportunity. I'm very pleased to be able to share that with you, especially.
And first and foremost, for our listeners and viewers, who is Richard Bernato in simply one sentence?
I am a person who passionately believes that my responsibility is to shape educational systems and I'm going to use a fancy word, catalyze others to empower each other to recreate what we do.
Thank you so much. And now let's dive into the book before we again go back a little bit to your biography, because you have so much to offer. And I want and I love to really get more out of you, really who you truly are. So, what made you write the book in the first place?
This is actually I got my fourth book, and all of them have been circling around the same premise of a word I think I created. I'm not sure if I did. The word I use is futuring, ing. And you can use it as a noun, as a verb, as a gerund, and who knows what else. So I use that term interchangeably, and essentially what the word suggests is that we have the capacity to we have the capacity to forecast what we think is going to happen in terms of, in this case, specifically about educational development and systems. We can recreate that to more nearly meet the needs of the 21st century expectations, even expectations we aren't aware of. We can do that, except that we don't do it. We don't really do it very well. And the premise of futuring uh, isn't foreign to anyone. Everything that we do is grounded in that. One author whom I cite in the book, Cecily Summers, points out that we are all futurists. When you put on your shoes in the morning, you're choosing whether your shoes match your socks or your outfit. And basically, what you're thinking to yourself is that you want to, depending on the person, you want to present yourself to others to show that you don't have a color clash. The squirrel buries her acorns to grow oak trees. Farmers retill their fields every year against the future that they know that they want. And and again, this is not an original thought. I got this from I believe his name was Edwin Cornish, who said when you talk about the future, there's three P's: what's possible, what's probable, and what's preferable. What educators need to figure out, according to how they realize their viewpoint of the future is. Educators need to figure out most of anything is possible, but there are some events and ideas and occurrences that are going to be more probable. Now, once we sort out which we think is most probable, then we have to decide whether we want that to happen, whether it's our preferable future. And if there's a gap, as there often is, we would be obligated to figure out whether we want to adapt to whatever the probable future might be dictating to what we really want to happen, or if we want to just sort of totally go at the system to remake it and redo it. And I would, this is a stretch. I'm going to share this with you, and I can see people disagreeing with me about this. It's my opinion. I can give you an anecdote about that if it's okay. It's my opinion that our society should have seen COVID coming. Not necessarily specifically COVID in February of 2019 or March, when it really hit us between the eyes, but we should have been ready for a development like that, so that when it did hit, we would have been better prepared for its effects. I was talking to a superintendent just before this was happening. I was going to do a consult to myself and two my colleagues in a district in a rather poor part of New York State. And I said to the superintendent, who happened to be one of my mentees in his dissertation, I said, "Are you ready for what's coming?" It was his February. And I said, "Are you ready?" And he says, "For what?" And I said, "Pandemic is coming. You're going to be closing your schools." And he said, "We're not closing the schools. We're out in the boondocks. We're out in a rural part of New York. That's something that's going to happen in the cities, maybe, but certainly not going to happen out here." I said, "Listen to me. It's happening everywhere. What are you going to do about it?" And he went on to say that everyone, two things. It was a very poor district, extremely poverty stricken. However, every child in the school system had a Chromebook. Most of these kids lived in trailers instead of houses. And again, they was very poor. So he went on to say, "Well, all the children have Chromebooks." And I said, "That's great. What are you going to do when they're not in school?" And he said, "Well, since they're living in trailers, they don't have Wi-Fi." So I said, "So the Chromebooks are useless?" And he went, "Maybe." So I said, "What are you going to do about that?" And it never occurred to him. Now, there's other events and tragedies that we all know can occur and have occurred in other countries that where school systems have been completely. I did a session in Ecuador a couple of years ago. I did a Zoom session with Ecuadorian teachers. They were wonderful people, and who spoke better English than I did. And I could hear some noise in the background. I said, "What's that?" He says, and one of the teachers said, "That's gunfire. They're shooting at each other again." And they had kept their schools open because that's the way, that was what was happening in their in their city at the time. Uh, and so they somehow adjusted that. I don't know how they did it to meet that probable future and continue their education program. And to use a word that I don't like to use too often, but we're lousy futurists, school leaders and teachers. We I think have a generalized. And I can't prove this by research, just because I'm old and I experience a lot of things. Anywhere I go to do a consult, I often get the idea that the educators who are in the group with me, including leaders, often don't think they have any control whatsoever what the future, whatever that means to them. It's as if they're on uh, uh, a roller coaster in the dark, and the tracks are taking them wherever they're going without their control, and they just have to accept whatever that will bring them. Well, if that's their mindset, and it seems to be pretty often very predominant, then we're doomed to accept whatever the fates may generate for us, and then that's not what we should be doing. Instead, we should be grabbing the future by the throat and making it our own.
Why do you think is that specifically in education? Why are we not good futurists, and why don't we actually teach this more broadly, like really futuring, and as you lay out in the book, in terms of also simulation, right? Like, because I think that's what any business has to do it. So what do you think are the main reason why this is?
But there's two levels to that. One is that, since I taught in many leadership preparation programs, still do, from the doctoral level down through master's degree, uh, and part of it is maybe it's a unit, or maybe it's a course sometimes, that's offered in higher education to train would-be leaders to recognize what change means and how to implement it properly. And that's just not enough time. It's just not enough investment, and it's not enough. It's not taught properly. This is why we go back to the simulation, where I'll come to in a minute. And then we also have I think, the mindset where our students are generally used to being passive, not expected to really contribute to their own learning as such, especially as you get up higher. I mean, you're a teacher yourself. You know what I'm talking about. It's difficult to get engagement sometimes with students, especially with this electronic uh, necessity in terms of Zooming and all the other uh, systems that we were using it to teach electronically. And it becomes a talking head premise, and people just sit down and listen as if they're watching television, and it's not effective. So now, to dig deeper, come back to your question. Now you're getting me to roll a little bit now.
No,
is that
fantastic.
uh, is that again, the mindset, in my view, is passivity and acceptance of whatever they think their cultural deepest beliefs are, the ones that we don't talk about. Peter Senge, many of you have probably heard of Peter Senge. He wrote The Fifth Discipline and several other books, a person whom I admire very much. And Edgar Schein, person who they're both out of the University of Massachusetts, UMass, I should say, and no, I'm sorry, the Sloan Institute of MIT. And there's, among other theorists from that particular institution, they point out that so much of what we do is like an iceberg. The iceberg only shows as 10% of its mass above the ocean level, and the other 90% is hidden. And the only way you know it's there is when you hit it and sink from it, like the Titanic. And at the same time, those hidden beliefs are not owned up to and not recognized, and that's what steers what people do and don't do. Every time one of my students gets an administrative job, first thing I say to them is, learn the culture. And I don't mean like who the kids are, whether they're from different ethnicity. I don't mean that. What I mean is learn the hidden beliefs that have generated how that school or school system has operated from time immemorial, for as long as it exists. And once you can bring those things to the surface, people began to realize I did session a couple of years ago with in a building, and one person wound up saying, they were having all kinds of academic problems, and one person wound up saying, "Well, the kids here don't want to learn." And everybody kind of gasped for a moment because it was such a foreign thing for people to say. But she said, she hung with it. She said, "No, I don't think these kids are interested in learning." And she got taken to task on that. But in the end, there were several other people who silently had always believed that, didn't think they really had to go the extra mile anymore to have these children want to learn, notwithstanding what they were confronted with in their home lives and their economic situations and so forth. And so that those hidden beliefs have to be grappled with. It's actually one of the first stages of the simulation that I wrote up in the book. If you want me to go to that, I'd be happy to go there. But in case unless you have some other questions that go with this.
No, no, that's perfect. Uh, you know, you lay out so many important also techniques and actually how to implement this and how to walk through it with the whole leadership team, but also take into account like the politics beyond the school, right? All the stakeholders. So you really lay this out brilliantly and you give really tangible, actionable steps for a school to implement and to be successful. Now, my question is this, that there's already so much going on, and you know this much better than I do, that there is a lot on teachers, administrators' plates, right? And so, how did you address the buy-in? Where do you see the biggest challenges when you identified this critical piece that was missing? That we always see the iceberg, but we don't really see what's going on underneath, and therefore you came up with futuring, with simulation. And I'm just curious about the roadblocks that you have faced and still you're facing when it comes to, let's say, future administrators who come to you and want to implement that, but they somehow really hit hard on simply the fact that their people are not very receptive to actually do something like futuring because it's not immediate, right? We all know people, teachers, administrators, they have a lot of their place. It's a lot of paperwork as well to do. So, how do you respond to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a complicated one. I'm not sure where to begin. I have found, and I use this word a lot, that once you immerse them, this might be a little too general, and I have no problem you saying this is too general, Rich. Uh, Once you immerse them in the process of reflection, uh, it will emerge organically. If I, as the facilitator or the catalyst of the simulation, for example, tell them what to think, some people will give you the nodded head and accept it, and others will silently just sort of retreat and drop out psychologically, if not actually. But the more one gets immersed in the process, I got a quick story about that too. Once you immerse them in the process, and you have to be patient about that. Uh, Many of these strategic planning sessions that so many administrators always take upon themselves, especially if they enter a new school district or school, is when everyone wants to do a strategic plan, and when they really should just wait on that until everyone becomes accustomed to each other, is the time element. You just have to make that time happen. Quick story: I did a strategic plan sessions in a, I'm not going to say the island, but it was a very, very tiny island off in locally that had, I think, about 2,000 people who lived there year round. And maybe there was another during the summer. It was the billionaires would move in and take over half of the island. The people who lived there year round were people who, well, usually the servants and the caretakers who maintained the rich people's estates and so on until they came back. And they were the people who sent their children to the local school. And the local school was maybe only about 100, 120 students total from K all the way up through 12th grade. And I'd asked them all to bring in artifacts that they thought represented their district, sort of like an Indiana Jones thing. And I didn't get that idea originally. That was from Edgar Schein. And so what happened was one man brought in a picture of a 6-foot lobster that he had caught skin diving off the island. And we spent 3 hours talking about that picture. The other people had brought in the pictures of students and bulletin boards and those sorts of things, all valid. But we spent 3 hours figuring out why he brought that in and what we thought it represented, what was beneath the surface of the ocean, literally, in a certain sense. And after about 3 hours, what began to emerge from them was this was an island. The students who lived on the island and they would add new things in typically would finish their from what I can see, a pretty good education from kindergarten through senior year high school. Some of them would go back to the mainland to go to school or to training and so forth. Most of them would come back because they just didn't like being on the mainland, and they came back to this little paradise island that they were living on. And in the end, what the hidden belief was, among others, was that their responsibility was to give a good, solid education in elementary school through high school. But it wasn't necessary for these students to really engage the world out there, because that wasn't part of what they do, because they were living in their own little bubble there, and they were just fine with that. And that emerged from them. I would coax them, I would prod them, I would be a pain in the neck sometimes, a pleasant pain in the neck, and sometimes not so pleasant, to kind of goad them to express themselves so they could hear each other and have the dialogue that they don't have the opportunity to do with any kind of routine. Finland is a good example of a place. A little bit of studying about that. Two of my students did their dissertations and literally went there and studied the systems and came back, and I learned a lot from them. And apparently, they have a special session every day. I may be misrepresenting that, this is how I recall it. But it's just teachers would go into the faculty room, have a cup of coffee, whatever, and they would be talking about the conditions of their school, how children, what was working for children, what was not, and why it wasn't working, and then they would group solve what they needed to do for the whole, with a W. You can't manufacture that. That can only come if you create a nurturing experience, like this artifact analysis activity I just told you. But for it to come, and then when it comes, the facilitator, the catalyst, throws her net around that, and then moves it to the next place. Now, as far as I have all these other things to do and all these other pressures that my teachers have undergone enormous stress with especially the past few years. I own that. I don't own it, but I certainly accept it and recognize it. Can't deny it. When that comes up, you have to give that its worth and give it value. But you can't allow. You have to let them figure out that you can't allow that to make that a reason for not trying to do your best by what you're responsible for doing in the end. And sometimes that gets lost in the trees for the forest, and someone, for example, from the outside would have to do that. Now, if I can go back to the simulation, is that okay?
Yeah, please.
If we talk about the simulation, you used some of my favorite words of 5 minutes ago. You absolutely have to recognize that school systems don't have the independence that they think that they have. That they have a collaborative dual relationship with the world out there. The world out there, whether it be you're in Costa Rica, or whatever the community is that you're serving in your building, and who the students are, is representative of moms and dads who are sending their students to you, and it's representative of the resources that they may have to bring that together, representative of the community values and hidden beliefs that they have, and how they have to be compatible with what is interior to the school, to the educational leadership team, so that they don't work at odds, that they work mesh together through the simulation process. Now, if you think about the word simulation, it's a word that that's used an awful lot, and I could talk for hours about this because something that's very passionate for me from when I was a social studies teacher back before you were born. And that would be that uh, we're involved with simulations every day of our lives, 7 days a week. Every movie we watch, every television program we watch, uh, every game we play is a simulation. It's a modified model of reality. We simplify reality in order for us to understand what we can make out of it to make it work well. The Pentagon, United States military think tank, uh, uh, has all kinds of think tank groups who are futuring as we speak and simulating war games. And what would happen if Canada attacked the United States? This sort of thing, heaven forbid. And then what will we do about it? It's part of what they do because what they're doing is they're taking a scenario, they're simplifying it, and then they're acting within it. So every model train someone had, I hope I don't sound sexist, every doll that someone played with, every TV show that we're watching, or every toy we play with. If you go to Walt Disney World or a theme park and you go on Space Mountain, you're pretending you're going up a mountain. Those are all simulations of reality. Now, simulations and I've done quite a bit of research on it. That's why I wrote this book. Um, are not used in graduate programs and training programs. I did some. It's just there's some out there. One I kind of liked a little bit, but even that was a little one dimensional. I thought uh, simulations are not a training tool used, except perhaps when a would be a student teacher or a would be intern, administrative intern, has a chance to learn from a cooperating administrator or teacher. It's about the closest thing they get to real experiences, and then we graduate them. We send them out into the world, working that world out there in school systems they may not even be familiar with, and then suddenly they have to figure out uh, how to solve issues that are really very thorny and very complex, and yet don't have this. They may not have the skills, nor will they necessarily, nor will their staff have the skills. That's a keystone of this particular simulation, because what I infused into this, among other things, was two teams: a world out there team and an educational leadership team, who had to each group needed to take a role, the individual roles, and individual skill sets. So one skill set, for example, would have been the culture expert. Another skill set would have been the systems thinker. Another one would be the futurist. Another one would be the creative person. Another one would be the collaboration specialist in each team. So they were charged with different tasks to establish. Like one of them early on was to come back to a question you asked a ways back, uh, to create their purpose, to recognize what their purpose is. You can't recognize the purpose unless you gather a lot of information and burn it off and find out what's at the bottom of the test tube. But once they were able to do that, they had to decide what their purpose was. So this group made its own purpose up, this group made its own purpose up. And they weren't necessarily at odds, but they certainly would from a different perspectives, as you had said earlier. And so they had to meet, they had to listen to each other, then they had to go back into their different rooms, and they had to decide whether they wanted to vote for that person's, the other group's purpose and goals versus the one that they had put together. And then they had them, and that's the simulation part again, which actually happens when you do a strategic plan, where people talk to each other informally at the water cooler or via emails, and then they come back in and they vote. And depending on the vote, then the simulation proceeds according, sort of like when you do a video game and you charge into the cave, and the first time you encounter the dragon eats you up. You go back and you try it again, or you use a strategy to get past the dragon to get to the treasure chest, to simplify things. And so so what they were doing was simulating 7 stages of the process, some of which you know, I reshaped, but it wasn't anything as though I recreated all of these stages. These stages have been in research in different places in different ways for a long time. I'm talking too much, I think. We have to slow down.
No,
That's
no,
when I get
please,
really excited.
please.
Uh, when they finally get to the point where they come, and I'll stop here for a moment anyway. When they really begin to future for what their choices may actually mean in a simulated atmosphere, and then the leapfrog this, and I'll come back later on to leapfrog that was when they finally get to a point where they recognize what the probable future is of the simulated world like we created for them. Then they have to decide whether they want to adapt to that or they want to transform away from it, which is a matter of second choice, obviously, is one of massive change rather than slow, incremental changes. By the way, the first 2-3 times I did this with administrators, with superintendents, none of the superintendents looked for transformative approaches. When we got to the end of this, I was flabbergasted. All they wanted to do was just to adapt slowly. And I said to myself, well, there's a lesson in that. Either they're very accepting of what their present state is, or they don't know how to get to a place where they're going to change their stakeholders to really look for new ways to realize. I'm going to stop there. I'm talking too much.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because to me it also shows something about really getting ultimately the culture right. Because as you said, it's very complex, and there is so many hidden beliefs, right? But I think what it also
Yeah,
does through this process, what you are suggesting in the book, really it clarifies. It really truly starts clarifying actually, what's our purpose, and what's the status quo, and what needs to be done potentially in order to go and face the future or not, right? I mean, you can be in denial, or you can actually prepare accordingly, really, and take actionable steps. And I think it really helps overall the culture to develop this. And therefore, I really appreciate this book. And it does so many things, because a lot of times there's so many unspoken things, and we all know schools, even though we might not think necessarily at first glance as a political place, are actually highly political places. And obviously it's
absolutely.
unavoidable, but it is a fact. And to really help going through, because ultimately we have to find some common ground whereupon we can all agree that this we want the best for our children, our futures, so that we have and keep having a fruitful engagement as well in the future. So how do you see that in terms of culture? Because to me, really, if you apply this, actually, I think it's transformative also from a personal standpoint.
Yeah, if you one of the first things I usually do is I'll ask all of the participants what they think the purpose of schooling is, and there's probably about 10 different choices that people could use. I'm talking from the United States culture for the moment, uh, with all respect to people who may not maybe in another country. Uh, the first reason why we had public education in what we call America now today, in the first colonies, was essentially to have students, to have children be able to read and write the Bible. That was it. That was it. It wasn't as though we wanted them to learn nuclear physics or anything like that. It was all a matter of being able to read the Bible. Period. When you get up and you start looking at this historically, you see there's probably 6 or 7. I'll just rattle them off quickly. One is strictly to be able to read and write. Another one would be to create good citizens. Another one, which is the one I embrace, although I recognize and respect some of those other points, is to create nurturing systems so the children, so the learners can think critically. We talked a little bit about this before we started the podcast. Can critically evaluate things and make good decisions. Those are just three choices, but there's all sorts of ones in between. And if you line up 10 people, you're going to get four or five different choices. And that's the first thing I would have to do as catalyst to try to get folks to a dialogue with each other, hear each other actively, to understand where they are. In fact, I just did this last night in class, graduate students, and they recognized very quickly that most of them were, I think most of them were of the idea that we were creating critical thinkers for the 21st century. So I asked them what they thought, and this is all a matter of impression. It wasn't, strictly speaking, research. Whether they thought their point of view was embraced by the rest of their colleagues, and most of them said they didn't think so. But how can you get people to want to change if there's different people have different expectations and definitions of what learning might mean? And that's all the more reason why information gathering is so important. I did a consult in a district that was very poor, very highly diverse population that was near several waste dumps. And there's political reasons why that was the case. And the graduation rate and attendance rate was hurting for lots of reasons. And what the high school principal, to his credit, was trying to do was create a career and technical education thread in the program, so that students could practice some careers that they may not think that they could be part of. And finally, and again, I'm going to mention a book that I think it's a little bit old now, but it's a terrific book. I recommend it highly. Read The Future is Happening Faster Than You Think. Peter Diamandis and get the other authors, two authors. Future is happening faster than you think. What they did was they broke down society and economics by various industries and movements. One was for medicine, one was for education, and so on. And technology, obviously. And one I always remember, and I share with the group before I come back to the district I'm talking about, was that there are driverless cars now, and the expectation is that driverless cars will become the much more numerous and dominating the transportation system over the next several years. Now, I don't know if that's true, but this is what they claim. I've never seen a driverless car on the road, and I would probably run away from it. But we all know that most of the new cars have certain aspects of that now. And so the authors go on to say that if you took out, if everyone were, or most people were using driverless cars, you wouldn't need parking lots. Now follow the future. If you don't need, by the way, all the parking lots in the United States, if the sizes were all added together, equal the size of Delaware. So the entire state of Delaware, whatever the acreage is. Now, what would you do with that? That's a future need that we haven't necessarily figured out yet. Solar energy, I don't know, but there's other. What would you do? How would you transform to that? Which goes back to when blacksmiths realized that the cars were coming 100 years ago. They had two choices. One would be to continue to be blacksmiths for the horses to pull the carts that were no longer needed, or they turn themselves into gas stations. To come back to my friends in this district I'm thinking about, that was kind of surrounded by these huge landfills. I said, and I had read this someplace else. I forget where I read it. That many of these landfills are actually being left alone to decompose, so that we can use I don't know the right word, to share the compost and whatnot for different growing needs, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So much so that this article argued that we're going to need, and this is a quote, this is not something I made up, we're going to need worm engineers. Because earthworms, as most people know, would break down the organic elements and turn it into useful soil. So I said to the principal, I said, yeah, I said, I don't think you should start a career thread for worm engineering, but this probably something you could figure out to create a mini course to get some students interested in that. And they may want to take it to an ecological uh, degree or study when they finish high school. And he hasn't done it yet, but he told me he's interested in doing that. That's a matter of transforming what we do by way of realizing that the future is demanding more of us than we're giving. I can't believe I said that. I never thought of that until I just said it, but I like the way it sounds. The emerging future wants more of us than we're probably giving it now, whatever it might mean.
Fantastic. You know what? And you remind me again, you are obviously from the United States of America, and they have always been the greatest visionaries. I think it's just unbelievable. And that's why I think the way you just brought all this to light is just so pertinent, and I really appreciate that. And coming back to some of your points that you were making, and one point is really important: information gathering, right? And you were also mentioning critical thinking and accountability. So there's so many aspects, but I want to just quickly go to critical thinking and then accountability, because it's interesting. And also, you were talking about, driverless cars. I mean, just what this ultimately will entail in terms of laws, and, who ultimately is accountable if something happens, and all those kind of things. I think sometimes in these kind of things, and I fully agree with you, I think we just make our life so much more complicated if we start doing certain things. And I'm completely in awe when it comes to Tesla, to Elon Musk, to reusable rockets. It's just mind blowing. I think it's unbelievable what we are witnessing these days. It's just mind blowing, and there's so much more to come. I can't even believe it. But of course, we also need people, and that's one of the big problems. Obviously, like public policy is always catching up, so it's kind of hard. It's a tough race, really, and sometimes it's kind of we worry. But I think a lot of times when we read these novels, fiction writers, right? They really have a purpose, and that's what you are also doing. They want to tell us a story that we actually pay attention and start really thinking about this in a very, very profound way in order to really avoid disasters. So I'm very, very hopeful in this sense, but that's why futuring simulation is so important. And I think that's really where it's going. And I also love what you're mentioning. And just to get this right, if is it possible, probable, and preferable, and then really make and walk through these stages with really the team, because this can really something in vogue, I think, that really brings people so much closer together. And in doing so, the likelihood that they really start understanding each other on a more human and fundamental level is really so much more likely. And I think that's also very helpful. And ultimately, the kids, the students really will get the best of our education. And so just quickly go back to critical thinking. And I want to know your take on that, because this also has become a buzzword, basically. Critical thinking means basically, and let's say 4 years ago, critical thinking was basically cancel culture. So, in other words, you had to rip apart the system, and we had to deny everything, or we had to admit everything and just feel ashamed about ourselves. Very, very problematic. When I think about those issues, they are very, very important, and we have to talk about those kind of things. But to me, it's always important, and that's why I love Solution Tree, because it always looks for sustainable solutions, you know, that we do not commit the same mistakes as we did, for example, in the past, right? And because, you know, humanity is a really, really complicated things. And when I really think about everything that happened, you know, in the world, it's on one hand, it's terrible, but on the other hand, it's also wonderful because all the people and we will not be here if the world will not happen the way it happened. Even though there's so many things, you know, tragedy that happened, right? But unfortunately, and you know, I don't know, is it fortunately or unfortunately, you know, there is in any situation, there is always an adversity, and there is also to this the equal amount the same opportunity. So I know that's very, very optimistic, but I think it has to do with empowerment because as you were talking about,
Yes.
what you're doing
Yes.
is really it's empowerment. And what we are usually not are doing, it is that oftentimes it's very disempowering. People, especially in education, they feel disempowered in one way or another. But we have to get them back that, hey, yes, even if it's just on a micro level, even if you can change one student's lives at a time, that's already wonderful. So I just want to have a little bit your take on critical thinking and what you mean by that, and also when it comes to really accountability and how you think they go together, especially in terms of futuring and simulation.
Yeah. Well, again, remember that a simulation is risk free. So you can do all you can make all these decisions, and if it looks like it's going to flop, it flops. No one's hurt by it. That's one of the reasons why I think the educators leaders don't like to do any massive changes because they're afraid they're going to hurt students. So and that's always a risk. There's an answer to that, but the simulation, in a sense, is a safe laboratory to experiment with do this with decision choices to go with that. And that's the word I wanted to infuse with the critical thinking question that you have. Decision making and critical thinking go hand in hand. Good decision making is a consequence of good critical thinking, and so I can make if I really parse something or analyze something, break it down through whatever laboratory process I want to consider. In the end, I can then make the decision based on my values and my culture too. We can't forget that to whether we should go forward or not with it. The simulation uh, co-creating when I was going to call it alchemy because originally I was calling it alchemy because to me it was about transformation, but the title was became co-creating the future. The simulation again is risk free and has two or three phases in it where we do what we call two-dimensional and then three-dimensional thinking. Uh, if thens, if I if we throw fertilizer into the pond, then the pond will die. If we figure out another way to, or another kind of fertilizer, then the pond won't die, and whatever your preferable future might be. And then as you get more complex, you get to the bottom of that pond and see what ripple effects happen when you throw that rock all the way down and hits the surface, or rather the bottom of the pond, to see the consequences of things. And I think that probably answers your question about accountability. School systems haven't been, I'm generalizing. I know I'm generalizing. School systems typically haven't been, public school systems especially, haven't been terribly accountable because they're a monopoly. They've been created by the government to educate all children, not necessarily with clear purpose, but they've been created and funded by the government to do that. And I haven't seen too many places. New York City happens. It's been happening more often. That's been closed because it hasn't met the kids' needs. There isn't a lot of accountability. Nobody gets fired if they try a new tactic to teach arithmetic. They might continue to incorrectly teach arithmetic. Hopefully not, but but it's not as though they're going to be hit over the knuckles because they were teaching it incorrectly. And so accountability in the public school systems is great to me. Which doesn't mean I'm arguing for charter schools or for homeschooling or private schools. It just means to say that and I'm not really that familiar with those types of schooling, except charter schools a little bit, and I haven't found that they're any better. If not, in many respects, they're so arbitrary and unilateral with how they approach things that they don't really impress me a whole heck of a lot. Anyway, so if we were to somehow, well, maybe accountability is another way to look at it. I like that. You're making me think now. If I, you're a social studies history teacher, I was. If you felt that your students couldn't give you the three reasons for the Civil War, would you just? I'm asking you rhetorically. Don't answer it out loud. Would you just march on and say, "Oh well, they don't know the three reasons for the Civil War"? Of course not. You go back and reteach it in a way that would meet the needs of the learning needs of the kids you're talking about. In mathematics and especially social studies, not quite as much, or in English, but certainly in science and math, I think uh, you can go for if they don't know how to multiply by two digits, and then you want them to multiply by three. It's not going to happen because the spiral effect is dependent on what the learning was before that. And some teachers will just march on and skip over that and continue to pretend that the students will have learned what they needed to learn, but they may not have it, and it may not feel accountable to do that. So that's a matter of, you're a social studies teacher in your school in which you work now, holding yourself accountable. Whether your accountability, here's the magic word, I think. Uh, Upon reflection, teachers don't have an opportunity to do all that often, unless they force themselves uh, to reflect on whether their actions align with what they think the purpose of the schooling is in the first place. Again, if it's just to have kids be able to read and write, that's a different kind of expectation to having my kids be able to decide whether the math problem is right or whether they've come up with three reasons for the Civil War that maybe I never thought of. Back in the day when I was teaching, for the most part, happily that's changed. For the most part, you told students that Columbus discovered America in 1492. And now we know that's not true. We knew it then too, but we didn't really acknowledge it because a lot of the research has only accumulated in the past 10 to 20, 30 years. Now we'll say to students, here are the theories about how America was discovered. Let's figure out who or how or what we mean by discover. Now we're talking about really parsing things, slicing and dicing them, and it doesn't matter whether the student ever knows who the different explorers were from whatever countries we're thinking about. It's matter that they've got the muscle of really looking at what's going on in their lives now, or what they think is going to happen down the line. Talk to students. You're a high school. You teach high school, I think you said. And having several grandchildren in high school now, I'm constantly amazed. They really haven't thought much further past 3 years from now about whether they're going to go to school, if they're going to go to school, and why they want to, what careers they want to take a look at. It's kind of and I'm sure it's a maturation issue to some extent, but it's also a matter of them not really having the exposure or the experiences to sift out what goes on. That's why I love teaching with simulations. I've been teaching with simulations since before you were born, and my own design. Sometimes things I've purchased online, but all different kinds. And this particular book was first. Well, I've been doing it for about 10 years, but it's the first one I have done for a leadership approach with schooling, because that's my most recent passion, is to get leaders to understand what they need to do to be catalysts.
Yeah, I really love your work, and I think it's so important, and to just implement this and to really play this through this scenario, because really it's a simulation. You can't really hurt anyone, but you will also actually
No,
address some feelings versus facts, which is really about values, right? And I think that is one of the big things, I think, that to clarify certain values, within a team, school, a culture, a district, it's just so helpful. But unfortunately, also that to some extent, our culture has somehow, I don't know, it's almost like paralyzed, that we don't somehow want to talk about it, because, it can be kind of can be lead us into hot waters, right? But I think it's so much needed to actually do this. And I also like what you said previously, really, this immersion experience, right? Because that's when we really can get something out. That's where focus comes from. That's where ultimately satisfaction also results, right? When we are immersed in something, when we ultimately forget time, because we really do something that matters to us and really the culture as a whole. I just want to quickly touch on more general the curriculum and what you think and what your thoughts are in terms of how it should be changed, if at all, and if how, because there are basically two schools of thought. Some say, well, you know what, it's too political, or it's almost like propaganda, because the government wants us to think a certain way. On the other hand, you have some people who say, like, no, that's important because it somehow, it levels equalizes the playing field, so everyone has to some extent the same information. Therefore, it's much more likely that we start understanding each other, because we kind of start from common start. So how do you see that, when it comes also to futuring?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. A great question. I hear it on two levels. So I'll give you the. I may miss what you're asking for. So yank me back if I don't connect back to what you're driving at. In my view, curriculum as in content, for the most part, is silly for its sake. People would argue that point. If I usually watch Jeopardy every night, and you need to know a lot of things in order to win the Jeopardy game, but you also need to be able to figure out what the processes beneath the question to truly be successful at it. So there's a book by Lawrence Kremens out of Columbia University. Uh, it's called The Process of Education, and that transformed me when I read it a long time ago. Where he argued for the processes rather than the content. I may be overstating it a bit, probably am, but um, let's take social studies for example, but certainly math and science and English, all of them lend themselves obviously to critical thinking and creativity and decision making among the three skills that come to mind. When we talk about really teaching properly, we should be not teaching in silos. We should be weaving our the underneath of all curricula to support each other in terms of all the different kinds of thinking skill systems that are out there, so that they can lend themselves to pass the interdisciplinary surface level point deeper to the opportunities to think critically. Now, I missed your second part of that question. Oh, you were talking about uh, the presentation of material and whether teachers have the. I just taught this yesterday. Uh, the presentation of material or ideas, wherever it may come from. I just read today that 1/4 of the United States thinks that the world is flat. I don't know if that's a true fact, but that's what I read. Well, if that's the case, then we've missed the boat. We have failed how we teach uh, science, if nothing else. Um, and so, a teacher is obligated to do two things: to present information neutrally. It's immoral in a certain sense for a teacher to press consciously press her or his opinions on her students at whatever age level, so they would think mirror what the teacher is thinking. That's just wrong. But a teacher is at the same time obligated to present a spectrum of material where the student can sort out and perceive what seems to be true for them, and that's a matter of maturation. If I'm teaching Goldilocks and the Three Bears in the first grade, I might say Goldilocks is guilty of breaking and entering the Three Bears' house. Should we put her on trial? And would she be guilty for breaking and entering the Three Bears' house? That's a great, and I've done that. It's fun to do, actually. And again, I didn't make that activity up. I read it someplace. But in the end, if they're 6 or 7 years old, they don't really know how to weigh evidence unless you really know how to tailor the evidence so that uh, they're free to really make decisions at their level. I don't know if you have any children, but I remember my oldest daughter, who's I think 50 now, 50, 51, who knew she liked chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream at 6 months old. Because if you put a little ice cream cone for her to lick, she would always go to the chocolate one. She knew she could have make that choice because it tasted better to her than the vanilla one. But that's a matter of physical tasting, obviously. But if I were to ask a 10th grader to decide whether Hitler was a great man or not, the question then drops down to, what does great mean? Do I include great as a moral uh, person, or do I equate great with whether I put people back to work, or whether I do these other things, and I overlook all the terrible things that he did because of these things that are historically, maybe economically, maybe noble. That's about creating experiences, and that's about working students through the opportunities that they don't ordinarily get to make those kinds of choices. I taught a lesson a million years ago where I did a role play. It wasn't a simulation, but by the way, a simulation is a role play within a gaming scenario model where you described it. So it's more than a role play because there's rules around it, which you'll see in the book. What I did was I took a chapter from a book about from a novel where a young teenager saved a Tory from being tarred and feathered during the colonial American Revolution. And now the revolution is finished, and uh, the Patriots have won, and they want to put this character on trial for being a traitor because he helped the Tories, who were traitors according to the Patriots. And they signed rolls, and I put the kids in place, and I was getting observed that day. I can't even begin to tell you. I couldn't have written a script that was any better than this. The kids started at the bell, finished at the bell, made a decision about whether he was. I think they found him not guilty, and I was as proud as I ever could have been. I went up to my supervisor, and I was waiting for him to pat me on the back, on my head, and say, "Great job, Bernato." And he said, "You do this." I won't use the word. You do this often? And I said, "Yeah, I do it quite a bit." He said, "Well, this is just Madison Avenue flim flam. And I want to see you teaching the next time I come in." And I said to myself, "Holy crow! You don't understand what I'm trying to do here. You don't get it, and you're my boss." And if leadership still has an antiquated, narrow, slanted, uh, corrupt view of what education is about, then we just perpetuate our mediocrity. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I know, no, really. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate what you say, immersion and experience. That's really, to some extent, also teachers' role, right? To give and help students to immerse in a certain content area so that they can really, you know, gain new insight, and that's not easy actually to do in especially in educational settings where today's youth so much on the plate, right? I mean, I luckily
Yeah.
haven't had to deal with social media, with all this pressure, all this noise around you. So it's really, really hard. And it's a giant task for today's youth to really navigate this complex, really world. But with leaders such as you, I think it's possible that we continue to provide outstanding education, so our future is really guaranteed, and we prepare young minds for a brightful future. So yeah, it has been a true blessing to discuss your book with me, and I'm just now curious, what makes you feel alive?
Hmm. Yesterday, last night I was teaching a class about change, and I couldn't drop them into the books specifically. There wasn't enough time where the curriculum is set up by my superiors. So I've given them bits and pieces of it, and they've been kind of I wouldn't call them passive, but they've been sort of wary of what I was trying to have them recognize. And when I began to drop them into some certain specific forecasting skills connected to the changes that they were trying to effect in their own buildings and school districts, I could see little lights going on. Like I was after I finished, I went back to my wife. I said, I think they finally drank the Kool-Aid. And so nothing pleases me more when I see, um, whoever it was who said that experience is the best teacher. They began to recognize that there were more possibilities and probabilities than they have ever recognized before, and that they have the power to empower themselves and other people to do that. That makes me as pleased as anything else I can think of, other than the health and happiness of my family.
Dr. Rich Bernato, thank you so much for truly be a blessing to me and really the world. And I can't wait to really further this discussion with you and really engaging and keep engaging with your work.
With this, with your permission, can I just add one more point? All right.
Please.
Uh, and this is, I don't know what I mean by this exactly, but a few things. Not that I'm thrilled when people buy the book. Okay, there's the book, although it's backwards on the screen. I'm thrilled when people buy, and even more thrilled when people use the book in increasing numbers. They are. What I would love to see, if folks wanted to reach out to me, maybe through you, maybe you could be part of it for that matter, uh, where we could run an online co-creating simulation around the world or across the country, where we could participate in the different tasks associated with this, so we could all see how this has great effect for what leaders could preferably be.
This is a
But I have to say,
fantastic.
I love that idea. I just hope if somebody wants to talk to me about it, just talk to Yannick or send me an email, and we'll take it from there.
Please, and most important, now go on solutiontree.com and buy a copy of Co-Creating the Future, because the future really is now. It's in your hand. Published by Solution Tree. So solutiontree.com, and then just click the link, search Co-Creating the Future, Dr. Richard Bernato. What a blessing and what an idea. I would love doing this, and I'm sure we get some folks on board. This has been a true blessing, and thank you so much, Dr. Rich Bernato, for your time and your wisdom.
I'm very appreciative of the opportunity. I'm thrilled to meet you. Very thrilled to meet you, and look at the probable futures we may be able to generate together. And I reach out to anyone who sees this. I'll be happy to answer questions, help them understand what this is about. Though the book is very self-contained, it has a lot of answers, questions you might maybe have considered. But clearly, this podcast does a great service for folks, and I'm pleased to contribute to that.
Dr. Rich Bernato. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.